Welcome, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us. This is Global Session on Measuring and Reporting on Efforts to Support Gender Equality and Women's Empowerment. My name is Will Stebbins, and I am the Communications Lead at the World Bank's Independent Evaluation Group, and I have the privilege of moderating this session. So over the past decade, the Asian Development Bank, the International Fund for Agricultural Development, and the World Bank have all increased their focus on and support for gender equality and women's empowerment. Thanks to evaluations conducted at each of these organizations, we now have a detailed picture of what is working and what isn't across these various efforts. Each of these evaluations assess similar periods. And you will see from the slide that is going to come up shortly that the findings of these evaluations are also strikingly similar. Each organization has successfully, excuse me, there is the slide, thank you very much. So each organization has successfully mainstreamed the inclusion of a gender angle in projects and the identification of these projects using markers for tracking progress at the corporate level. This has raised the awareness of the importance of tracking gender inequalities, but it has not always encouraged more ambitious, transformative approaches. Gender mainstreaming has encouraged a compliance approach in many instances, and by not distinguishing between projects directly focused on addressing gender inequality and those with gender as simply as an add-on, breadth has been encouraged over depth. Important lessons are also being lost by monitoring and evaluation systems that are unable to capture the results of transformative gender projects. Now, to talk more about these missing lessons and the unintended consequences of mainstreaming, we all have the privilege of hearing from the lead authors of each of the three evaluations. So let me welcome and introduce Owen Malloy, Senior Evaluation Specialist in the Independent Evaluation Department of the Asian Development Bank, ADB, Elena Bardasi, Senior Economist at the World Bank's Independent Evaluation Group, IEG, and Monica Lomenia-Gelis, Senior Evaluation Officer at the International Fund for Agricultural Development, IFAD's Independent Office of Evaluation, IOE. So we're going to start today with a moderated discussion on the findings of the three evaluations, following which there will be an opportunity for questions from our participants. And please post your questions in the chat at any time during the session, and we will aim to have as many answered as time allows. We will then wrap up with a rapid round of 1-minute summaries from each of our panelists of how they see the way forward for truly transformational support for gender equality. So let's start with gender mainstreaming, which across ADB, IFAD, and the World Bank has achieved breadth, but struggled to incentivize and promote depth. I'd like if each of you could please talk about your findings on the reasons and implications for this going forward. Monica, let's start with you.
Thank you very much for that question and for the opportunity to share some of the findings of this thematic evaluation of the contribution of IFAD on gender equality and women's empowerment. I wanted to very briefly introduce everyone what IFAD is, because sometimes it's the least known agency from the ones around the table today. We are both development bank and also a specialized UN agency, and our mandate is focus on rural poverty, and that means that for decades we have been focused on working with rural women, the last mile, as some people would put it, trying to mainstream gender in every single intervention. So there have been guidance and tools, including this gender marker since 2013, which follows from design of projects to completion what is the contribution of those projects to closing gender gaps and having gender results on the ground. From the Independent Office of Evaluation, we have also been rating independently a criterion, separate criterion on gender equality and women's empowerment. So that was something that we used in this evaluation to see a little bit what has been the evolution of those ratings. Unfortunately, on the bad side, maybe as an independent evaluator, what we found is that our reporting systems have been focused too much on these ratings from 1 to 6, very unsatisfactory to very satisfactory. And we have been too much focused on reporting on quotas, what the projects wanted to achieve, how many women, how many men, usually the usual counting beams, instead of trying to bring some of the results, evidence on results of how these gender gaps have been breached or how the projects have contributed to do so. In addition, also in the evaluation, we found that the gender mainstreaming was problematic in some cases because we were double counting beneficiaries in some cases, or just saying women participated in this activity, but we did not know what they took from that participation. It's also very interesting that in our case, also apart from this gender mainstreaming, there have been efforts also from management in IFAD to try to assess women's empowerment. And for instance, we have used some indexes from research, like the Women Empowerment, in Agriculture Index, and how to follow these measures from design to completion, or at least to measure them twice during the project cycle. But still, this is not talking to the M&E systems of the projects, and it's done in just one part of the portfolio. In addition to all these efforts, to go to this depth that was mentioned in the question, from 2019, IFAD has been trying to mainstream what we call transformational approaches to gender, where we try to catalyze changes to the norms and the culture where our projects are happening, especially trying to catalyze changes that are endogenous happening on the ground. What we found is that there is widespread misunderstanding of what gender transformative programming entails or what gender transformative approaches entails without mentioning the translation issues. Now we are talking in English, but if you talk about this in Spanish, my mother tongue, it can be misleading, and the same in other languages. So I think that's something that we need to address to ensure that we are talking about the same, so we avoid misunderstandings and so on. I would stop here for this question. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Monica. So, Owen, I saw you nodding your head. It seems like that what Monica was saying was clearly resonating with you. Now ADB was a leader among multilateral development banks in establishing mainstream categories. Can you talk about ADB's experience with gender mainstreaming?
Sure, thank you, Will. And I was nodding because, that's what's striking about these evaluations. It's the kind of similarities, the similar issues, across all the institutions. And yeah, I mean, for ADB, indeed, its focus on, gender equality has very much been about gender mainstreaming. And this dates back to a 1998 policy on gender and development, which sort of framed gender mainstreaming almost as an end in itself. It didn't frame clear outcomes that, we would like to achieve from this mainstreaming. And that approach has kind of persisted, at least until 2019, when, similar to what Monica mentioned at IFAD, there was a new strategy introduced that, framed these more ambitious transformative sort of agendas. And again, big questions over what that actually means in practice and how concepts such as gender transformative change can be actually operationalized. Now here I would nearly suggest that IFAD is probably further ahead in operationalizing these concepts. What we found at ADB was, while a high-level strategy introduced these terms, including also intersectionality, recognizing the kind of where gender inequality might intersect with another marginality or vulnerability. But again, there wasn't, the institutional systems for gender mainstreaming didn't really catch up with these high-level ambitions. So that was one kind of clear finding, that ADB sort of needed to update its systems for gender mainstreaming. In terms of this question of breadth versus depth, ADB has achieved, remarkable breadth across its portfolio. So according to its own metrics, it's achieved near 100% effective gender mainstreaming across all projects. But of course, that raises questions then as to, well, how meaningful is that mainstreaming? And here the evaluation undertook quite a rigorous analysis, looking at all these projects we categorize as sort of having a gender theme, a gender equity theme. And we also looked at a sample of these, nearly 100% projects that are effectively mainstreaming gender. And indeed, that's where, the kind of quality and depth, it varied significantly. And we also saw sector disparities, so ADB as a development bank has very much an infrastructure focus, and the energy sector and transport sector would be sort of predominant in our portfolio. And in some respects, the kind of opportunities for meaningful gender mainstreaming might be more constrained, depending on a certain sector. For instance, it might be easier, but there may be more opportunities, for instance, in a health sector or social sector project, education sector, or even agriculture focused project than, say, a transmissions line project in the energy sector. And what we found was there was a lot of pressure from senior management, from the board, to ensure that these targets for gender mainstreaming were met. But this kind of strangely led to these incentives among staff to sort of, at any cost, sort of add on just gender activities, have a gender action plan for, certain activities here and there. But we questioned whether these were really related to the broader objectives of the project. So again, I don't want to characterize these efforts as add-on activities, but there was this question of compliance mindset over really adopting a sort of gender equality lens from the outset. I could go on, but I'm also thinking we could probably talk back and forth, and perhaps I will hand over to Elena if you wanted to kind of come in on any of those points. Thank you.
Elena, please go ahead. Thank you, Owen, for that. I mean, I know the World Bank is in a similar circumstance where almost 100% of projects have been gender tagged. What are the implications?
Owen presentation, it's really overlapping quite incredibly to many of the patterns that we also saw at the bank. So when the gender strategy was introduced in 2016, and back then, almost 10 years ago, it was noticed that this gender mainstreaming, a lot of activities were gender informed by the time, was not really informative. It was sprinkling gender in many different directions, etc. So there was an attempt to really move to a much more focused approach with the introduction of the gender tag and the gender flag in IFC. So essentially, the idea was to mark those projects that were clearly addressing a gender gap, were taking some action to close it, and were measuring the results. And so this was the intent, to generate this more focused approach. However, like in IDB, at the end of the period, we observed that 100% of the projects are gender tagged in the bank, less in the IFC, but rapidly increasing also there, which raises the question, of course, of what it really means, essentially. Before telling why, in my mind, this happened, let me say how we define the more gender transformative intervention. So the gender transformative intervention for us was inspired by the conceptual framework of the World Development Report 2012, and is defined as an intervention that tries to address the root causes of gender inequalities. So that is not just filling a gap, but also asking what are the reasons why this inequality keeps being reproduced. And very often this is related to norms, to institution, to agency. And so there is the need also, if one wants to, also aiming at sustainability and scale, to address those elements. And we found that in order to do so, we need to take a more focused approach, but also a country engagement approach that tries to identify, select intervention not just individual project, but also, coming together technical assistance, the knowledge, all what is necessary to act on several fronts to move the institution, the agency, and resources, and therefore being impactful. And these interventions are complex, are multi-sectoral, holistic, and so this was what we define in the evaluation, a gender transformative intervention. So this was the intent, maybe not transformative. We know we can't do this everywhere. It needs to be focused. It's probably limited. But the flag was meant to mark something more substantial than just, the presence of some gender lens some way. So why are we back to the old mainstreaming? If we look at the 100%, we're not able to distinguish anything anymore. So to some extent is a very similar story as in IDB. So these flags were not designed to really mark these projects, or the intent was there, but then it became very quickly a marker of success. And there were regions that were even competing in going above the initial targets that were set up. So it was more creating awareness, perhaps generating the compliance with the minimum standard, but not really identifying more substantial intervention. Then there were also some other issues, like, for example, this was only done at design, not a follow-up at implementation, and therefore able to express the results. So there were also this other problem. But the point is, at the end of the day, these more impactful interventions are not identified at the corporate level, which means that we can't really learn from them. We can't manage them correctly and move on and understand which results we are achieving. So
thank you very much for that, Elena. So let's move on to monitoring and evaluation systems. And just before we get there, I wanted to, I appreciate Owen trying to initiate a conversation amongst the three of you, which I, like Miles Davis, I am happy to introduce a theme and then step back and let the players take it away. So I'm happy to melt into the background. So please feel free to jump in. So monitoring and evaluation systems, I mean, we from each of the three evaluations, the findings show that they really focus on outputs or reach, but often fall short in capturing gender results or transformative change. So what are some of the factors you found to be contributing to AM&E shortcomings, and what needs to change to address them? So Elena, why don't we come back to you, and why don't you kick us off on this this round?
Yes, thanks, Will. Yes, what we observed was clearly a shortcoming in monitoring and evaluation. Larger use of sex disaggregated data, which is important and essential, but is not sufficient to capture the full depth of results. Very often it's about measuring outreach or about measuring access to a service, but this doesn't tell us much about whether There is also control in addition to access, where there are changes in norms that are going to support this change, and so on and so forth. In some cases, it's just the extent of the project, you know, how big the size of the project is, which is really, you know, it's interesting, but it's not telling us in any case how which results were achieved. So if we want to move, I was talking before about the gender transformative intervention, we definitely would like to see some changes at that level, like, for example, change in GBV, in gender-based violence, or changes in empowerment, whether women and girls have the ability at economic, political, and social level to be more empowered. If they can control the income, for example, access it, and so on and so forth. The intersectionalities were mentioned earlier on. You know, women are not all the same, and we also would like to see more disaggregation at the level of who actually of these women is changing their status and their ability to see improve the quality. And even men and boys are also essential in intervening to shift the social norms. In some cases, they are themselves victims of inequalities when they don't conform to norms. In other cases, they are critical. In many cases, they are critical to shift those forms also for getting more equality for women. So all this wealth and richness of results, some of them which we saw and observed in our own primary data collection, is not regularly captured by our system. We observe, for example, that about 40% of projects include some outcome measures at the World Bank, which is much better than in 2016 when the previous gender strategy was introduced. But of course, it's much less than the percentage of projects that claim to close gender gaps. So why is that? To some extent, like Monica, I believe, was saying, there is not always clarity about what this means. It could be language, but it could also be the fact that it's not made explicit what the real intent is. The theory of change are not fully clarified. The assumptions that are made about creating change are not fully explicit, and so on and so forth. We also realize that we tend to use easy quantitative indicators that have limitations. So of course, it's not relatively not hard to collect indicators about outreach. Of course, it's much harder to collect and find good indicators about empowerment. We are not used to use qualitative indicators, for example, or narratives. This is a fascinating field that probably needs more investigation. And also what we notice in the evaluation, that there is also this tension between accountability and contribution. So in many ways, projects tend to select indicators for which they can be accountable for, instead of making the jump that actually, in order to achieve results, we can contribute if we embrace the country engagement approach, and therefore also what comes with it, meaning the collaboration with other partners, the co-production even with the society, with the beneficiary, the ownership of the country, of course. All this that is more centered on country engagement can't be attributed to a single actor or a single action, but it is a contribution, and therefore there is also a cultural shift that needs to happen there. I stop here.
Thank you, Elena. Owen, would you like to come in on?
Sure, thank you. Thank you, Will. And, again, many similarities with what we found with the Asian Development Bank in our evaluation last year. Well, okay. I suppose what you were getting as well in your question, Will, was also challenges in a sense, because the monitoring and evaluation shortcomings and what we found, it also stems in some ways from this kind of framing of outcomes, even at a corporate level. And in some respects, ADB, like I said, it only did this in its 2019 strategy. So when we came to evaluating this in 2024, maybe not enough time had really passed, and that kind of sense of framing interventions around these pillars of that strategy, we could call them outcome areas, that kind of mindset hadn't really become embedded or institutionalized. So that did create challenges also for us in the evaluation. Having said that, I just should point out that one similarity across the institutions as well is that often, these high-level strategies tend to have similar objectives or outcome areas. So I noted similarities, for instance, between ADB's 2019 gender equality strategy and IFAD's, framing of objectives I think they have. And here it's around, time poverty and drudgery reduction, for instance, or women's economic empowerment, some often similarities around, promoting leadership and decision-making or equal voice. I think ADB has extra pillars such as resilience to shocks and human development outcomes, given its focus as well. But I guess the point here I'm saying is that that kind of outcome framing hasn't filtered down to the kind of project level. So here at the project level, I think across the institutions, this was a common finding as well. In ADB, we found, very much kind of counting of beneficiaries, counting of women reached or trained, and then the kind of extra step removing this from sort of measuring an outcome is that these were, again, I don't want to say add-on activities, but these were kind of complementary activities to the larger project. So if I describe, for instance, an infrastructure project, a road project in a Central or West Asian country, here, instead of sort of measuring time savings, for instance, and the gendered impacts, say, for men and women as a result of this infrastructure investment, ADB's efforts were instead focused on, let's say, counting the number of women who were trained in a kind of side activity. Maybe there was a livelihood training activity, that was conducted by an NGO, recruited by the project, and that was what was measured. So what we felt were a lot of these kind of larger impacts were often just assumed, but not measured. And of course, there are practical limitations here in terms of if you're doing a time use survey, for instance, it's a very costly undertaking. ADB has done some of these using technical assistance funding, but again, they're costly endeavors. Ideally, we'd like to see more of these. What we saw in our analysis of project completion reports was, again, that, these sorts of benefits, if it's a water and sanitation project, for instance, it was just often assumed that women were the primary beneficiaries and they must have, benefited from time savings. But again, this wasn't rigorously measured. So again, yes, this is the pressure that our counterparts, our colleagues on the gender team, in ADB also feel they are often asked to do more, always, often with less. And there are those kind of real constraints as well. Another sort of constraint or kind of challenge, I guess, is, ideally we'd love to see more impact evaluations as well. That kind of really truly do demonstrate where impacts happen. ADB has made efforts to do this, but again, it's only in a subset of projects that are financed through grant financing through we call it the Asian Development Fund. So that's similar to the IDA of the World Bank. And here there is a special facility to, have dedicated gender-focused impact assessments for specific projects that have a very clear transformative approach, but that's a very small number of projects. So again, what I'm getting at here is that across the board, generally, we could see that, it was a very project by project approach to measuring, outputs of these sort of, gender action plan activities, as opposed to, this much more holistic sort of programmatic approach, as Elena, you mentioned as well, this sort of question of larger attribution, not just measuring what we can safely measure and be accountable for. And that was one of our recommendations as well, that ADB move more towards this kind of longer term framing of, you know, outcomes that it wishes to achieve. And that could be through its country partnership strategy documents, for example, framing these longer term outcomes. That has implications for us as well in the evaluation departments. You know, how are we going to then measure these more longer term changes? And one final point I should note is that we conducted we turned the mirror on ourselves in the evaluation department in a very critical way. We try to be transparent, but, you know, again, just seeing how are we shaping up, you know, so if we're putting pressure on ADB to have robust M&E systems, is the independent evaluation department equally robust in its project evaluations, in its independent validations of project completion reports? Here, you know, I should be honest that, you know, we found our systems also to be wanting, you know, that our guidance, for instance, should probably be updated. And I think there are discussions to be had among the multilateral development banks about this. And we have lessons to learn from institutions like IFAD and the World Bank as well. And also, you know, not only our guidance, but yeah, I think there were questions then of capacity development as well, and, you know, indeed. So again, just implications for the evaluators as well, and that our systems may also need to be updated if now we are really serious about these more transformative outcomes that has become the, dare I say, buzzword. So okay, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Owen. And that's a very good point on whether our evaluation, whether our approaches are up for measuring and assessing transformational change. Thank you for that, Owen. Monica, over to you on your findings on the monitoring and evaluation systems.
Thank you. I will try not to repeat or not to go into too much detail of something that my colleagues have touched on, because as we said, although we have tried to talk to each other before, like to avoid overlapping, unfortunately, some of the general findings are quite similar. And I wanted also to try to bring here some bright spots or good practices that we saw. So not just like, you know, all the issues that we find when we look at the whole portfolio as a whole. I think one of the factors that we found to be behind the shortcomings on M&E on gender results in general was that the quality of the gender and poverty analysis that it's done at the beginning of projects of interventions, it's quite variable. So we found good cases, but if we don't know what is the situation where we want to intervene with our local and our national partners, it's very difficult to know what are the gender gaps we want to act on. Otherwise, as Owen said, we remain quite vague or generic, saying like, we assume that if we do this activity, the situation of women or the equality situation is not always women who are like left behind. We also have many cases of young boys right now having real issues to access certain services and goods from projects. But if we don't know that situation from the outset, it's very difficult to then come up with a gender strategy or like an action plan, wherever you want to call it, to see what you can do in during the life of that intervention and what else is needed. As Elena said, it's not just about the project that is going to change some dynamics that have been there for decades or more. And what we also found is that even when we have this gender analysis at the beginning and then a gender strategy, like we have a plan, sometimes we found that this was not budgeted or this was finished too late to be acted. Like we found, I don't remember the percentage, but many cases where these project gender strategies were finished at midterm or later, when the project just had 2 years to move on. And also, we even asked during our counter case studies what were the power dynamics inside the project teams, for instance, if the gender person or the person dealing with social inclusion issues was the one who was like the more junior, the one not being seated around the table when decisions were made about the project, for instance. On the right side that I announced some minutes before, we found better reporting, and maybe this is related to what Elena said about this need of narrative and contextualizing results. We found better M&E data on gender when gender institutes or other institutions related to gender in the country or in the region where the project is happening were involved, either as project service providers or implementing partners. They were reporting more with more detail what was happening there, and were able to reconstruct more easily what happened at the baseline, more than this top-down M&E with indicators that we have from the outset, that they need to talk to the corporate reporting in our respective institutions. So that was one of the cases, and what we found is that engaging national institutions specialized in gender or women in IFAD projects was a factor related to a high gender rating in project and better reporting. So both, we have more data, but also more data to say like, yeah, this, we can learn from this. There is more information available. But of course, this requires time, resources, and also an engagement from the ground, from the local and the national level. And this is, I think, one of the things, maybe because IFAD is smaller and we bring less resources than the big development banks. But a message that we emphasize in our evaluation was that we can only catalyze what is happening in a certain country, in a certain place. We cannot impose any change. So I think that's important also when we think about our M&E systems and what we promise to our donors and our boards of directors. I stop here for this question. Thank you.
Thank you. And unless anyone has any follow-ups on what you all, the comments from each of you, I'll shift to, Owen introduced a note of introspection, and in view of our audience, I'd like to pose a methodological question. Considering that institutional M&E systems are an important source of evidence, how did the limitations of these M&E systems impact how you conducted your evaluations? Owen, do you want to take a crack at that one?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Will. Okay, I mean, I can speak about our focus. I have a colleague online, my colleague Nash Badiri, who actually co-led the evaluation with me. So she might come in and help me. So Nash, if you're online and able to unmute, please do, because it'd be great to hear your take on this too. What I can say is, look, for our evaluation, this was, by necessity, the scope of our evaluation was quite broad. It was looking across, the kind of policy strategy framework. It was looking at the institutional and kind of corporate systems for gender mainstreaming, the M&E systems, the staffing, the resources, so kind of a corporate level evaluation. And then also we felt, to satisfy others, we had to really say something on, the results on the ground, this question of outcome achievement. So that sort of framed 3 pillars for our evaluation. And to be honest, that sort of broad scope in such a short time frame as well, we had a matter of months. It meant we had to be quite, focused and selective with our methods, so we kind of, by necessity, then had quite a mix, of methods. For instance, for that question of outcome achievement or, results on the ground, given the constraints in the M&E system that we have discussed already, here we thought it best to kind of adopt a sort of country case study approach. So identify you know, not fully representative, because that wouldn't have been possible, but certainly, you know, illustrative project examples in different country contexts, ideally looking across the sectors. You know, again, ADB operates in multiple sectors, but just again to sort of illustrate certain issues that were coming up from the desk review. So that was our approach there. But then across the other strands, and here maybe, you know, Nash, if you did want to come in, by all means do interrupt me. But
Please,
I think
Nash,
you're still...
we'd be happy to hear from you. We see you. Please jump in.
Right, thanks. Yes, and as Owen mentioned, there is a lot of similarities that we're seeing across the World Bank and IFAD as well when it comes to these challenges that we're facing when it comes to monitoring and evaluation. And for our evaluation, it's really something that we wanted to do is going beyond the quantitative metrics and really avoiding the risk of just looking at outputs, right? And really trying to see what has been achieved when it comes to outcomes. And at ADB, that's based on our operational priority 2 on gender equality objectives that has been set out in strategy 2030 of ADB. And as Owen also mentioned, that included doing country case assessments, looking at existing evaluations of ADB programs as well. And as part of this evaluation, we also conducted a portfolio analysis, and that included, developing evaluation tools. And this includes a checklist, for example, for assessing gender equity team projects and coming up with a criteria. And that required really looking and digging into project documents, looking at results chains as well. And I think that was also mentioned earlier, the linkages between outputs and outcomes and results chains may not be as clear. And so that was one of the things that we made sure that we could also dig deeper into in terms of the indicators that are being used in different projects as well. We also looked at the guidance for assessing effective gender mainstreaming projects, and we sampled a couple of effective gender mainstreaming projects as well as part of the evaluation, looking at the links between gender action plans, outputs and outcomes, looking at transformative elements, stakeholder engagement, the robustness as well of M&E systems, and the presence of intersectional analysis. And as already mentioned, most of these elements are really quite underreported. And that helped us really understand what exactly are we trying to achieve and whether we are moving the needle when it comes to gender equality objectives.
Thank you very much. Oh,
sorry, just wanted to add one more, and then Owen probably could add to this. I'm not sure if Elena and Monica remember, we actually also reached out to them a couple of months back. As part of this evaluation, we tried to do a comparison analysis of the work that's being done amongst our different organizations. And that really sort of set the foundation for us as well. And that's something that's quite important for this evaluation.
Thank you very much for that, Nash. That collaboration is certainly very interesting, and I know that's something that is a sort of priority at IEG. So, Owen, did you want to come back in, or?
Well, look, maybe I'm looking at the clock, so maybe we should hand over to the other colleagues. Yeah, please.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you very much. That was going to be my next. That was going to be my follow-up on that. Thank you very much, Owen. And Monica, so how did you navigate the challenge of the shortcomings in M&E systems?
Yeah, I think I'm not going to repeat what Owen said. I think our evaluation approaches sometimes are very similar because it's the only thing you can do with the data that you have. So you try to, in our case, as I said at the beginning, we had the luxury of having like some kind of time series, at least, of these ratings of projects that have been rated according to their contribution to gender equality from design to completion, and also by the Independent Office of Evaluation. So that was our starting point, at least to try to make sense of what those data were saying, if we could see any trends. And then we try to complement that, especially what we did at the beginning was to identify what are the underreported areas in all that massive documentation that we had since 2013, that we have been rating these projects according to this criterion. And I think in IFAD, and I think Owen mentioned, I think in general we have been quite ambitious from the beginning, because there are clear descriptors of what it means to get this rating of 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 across this gender marker. And we also do the same when we are doing our evaluation. So, for instance, we managed to do an annual report on independence evaluation, where we try to see what are the trends of the evaluations that were finished the previous year, and try to see a 3-year period and how different ratings have evolved, including gender. So I think that helped us, but of course we needed, as Nash mentioned, we also did 11 country case studies, also go into the field, because another thing that is very important in the M&E systems of IFAD, maybe more than the big development banks, is that we don't only try to get results at the national or regional level, but also at the individual, at the household level and the community level. So I think with everything, with the field visits, what we tried to do was to bring back the voices of some of the beneficiaries to understand how they perceive what it's proposed in those projects and how it talks to them. Once again, to try to see if we are imposing a view that maybe it's not well received in the places where the projects are happening. And of course, we did many other things, but yeah, it was more triangulating with the money systems. And the last point, just to bring the attention of the audience, if someone wants to do it, we also try to innovate with some methodology that is called the qualitative comparative analysis. And we try to look at project completion reports. In total, we have 29 that were designed and completed since the gender policy of IFAD was approved. And we try to see in what circumstances IFAD project generated GWE outcomes, and what were the factors that were necessary to have this. And for instance, the finding I mentioned before about having specialized gender actors on the ground to have better results came from this attempt to use the QCA on gender. I stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Monica. That sounds like a potential theme for our next session on some of the methodological innovation. Thank you, Elena. Do you want to come in on the
yes? No, very, very interesting to listen to these challenges, because it was also our situation. Our innovation, if you want to call it such, is that we tried to introduce to use an algorithm. We were facing this big problem. No, we had a 100% gender tagged project, and we knew that the informative content of this was not easy. Was actually very, very, very small to be used for us. So we tried to create a score for each project, to using some of the characteristics of the project, but also some text analysis in order to understand the prevalence of gender, and therefore an intensity. We interpret it as an intensity, which couldn't still be used as such to really tell what this project were doing, but it was very useful to show that under a one gender tag or flag, there is a huge heterogeneity of situations that gets lost by just assigning the one score of the tag, the one mark. So we had to go in depth in order to understand more. We did also a country case study based approach. We decided to go for a positive selection because we were really interested in understanding how the country engagement can actually help in achieving better results. So we selected countries, 8 countries, where there was a sign of good engagement on gender equality. And within these countries, we selected the intervention that were more promising in terms of producing gender transformative results, because we were actually interested in understanding what were they doing, what are the factors that support that. And so we did, like Monica, we thought it was very, very important to go to the beneficiaries. We invested a lot of resources also to really have focus groups and interviews. We had hundreds of interviews and close to 100 focus groups in these countries in order to fully understand the perspective of beneficiaries and partners and the government, of course, but also religious leaders and men and boys and traditional leaders and so on and so forth. So this is really a wealth of information that we realize is very hard to get, but is it's really where you understand which type of results these interventions are producing, and this convinced also much more that we are missing so much in the M&E, classic M&E, because we found even a lot of good results that the institution is not fully aware of, and these get unrecognized, and therefore we can't leverage on those to learn. So it's really important to collect evidence also for that reason.
Thank you very much for that, Elena. So let's turn to some questions that have come in the chat. And as we're kind of running over a little, if I could ask everyone to be briefer in their responses, despite the fact that we have some interesting questions here. So so we talked a lot about shortcomings, and here's a question from Anastasia about good practice. So Anastasia asks, have speakers seen good examples of staff incentives toward gender transformation on the ground? Does anyone have a positive example from their findings that they'd like to share? Was an indication of good practice. Would anyone like to jump in?
Given that I have the mic open, perhaps
Please,
I can quickly say something. I'm not so sure if it is just a role of the incentive. The incentives are very important. As we see, the incentive can actually create a lot of unintended consequences. Where we observe a positive examples, and there are positive examples that are described in the evaluation, I think it was a convergence of factors, and it was a situation where there was an ongoing country engagement. We have an example in Peru, for example, where there is a project that has want to improve the performance of non-criminal justice system and the access of women to justice, including for GBV, for gender-based violence. And in this case, one can really tell that there is a lot of things going on. There is an improvement of the services, the physical infrastructure, the technical expertise of those providing the services. There is therefore there is also an effort to improve the access of women to these services. There is a connection with sector reforms that are happening at the country system at the wider level. So it's the important thing for us was that where things are really changing and transformative is because the approach is totally different. It's really important that people are actually have a good incentive to be engaged, but this is not the one individual or which exists. I mean, definitely the person that is highly motivated is making a difference, but is also having these conditions that create a prolonged engagement, sticking to an objective for the long term. And this very often happens where there are a cluster of intervention around a country engagement.
Thank you. Thank you, Elena. So I'd like to take another question from the chat, or Monica, did you want to come in? I just wanted
No,
to see.
very briefly, I wanted just to share that in IFAD we have these gender awards for staff, especially country directors, like and also gender awards for projects. So in some of the country case studies, what we found that it was a very good incentive. Sometimes for these people dealing with gender in the projects, maybe in remote areas, to get this recognition in the capital. So it seems it's not just through the performance assessments, but also this kind of recognition or a trip to the capital where the organization funding this project is based, for instance. So I think those are the incentives that come to my mind. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much for that, Monica. So we have a question here from Louise on a methodological question here. How can we ensure that gender evaluation frameworks are flexible enough to adapt to diverse cultural contexts while still upholding universal principles of gender equality?
I want to acknowledge that Lois is our gender lead in IFAD. So
Okay.
it's
and, okay. So it's a ringer. We've got a ringer. Great. That's
yes. But I mean, if I can try this one first, I think our evaluations, especially independent evaluations, try to respond or to be at least located in the space that management like draws with your own like policies, strategies, and so on. So I think we are all facing this issue of how much contextualized need to be, like what we do in general, but especially on the gender work that we do. So I think we need to get some kind of generic questions. But then, of course, when we do the country case studies, we need to adapt them, adapt the language, and adapt to the moment or what they are doing in that case. And I think, once again, this idea of catalyzing what is there is not the same working in a place where there has been lots of work done by civil society in terms of women's rights and other types of rights than in another one that it's more conservative at a certain point. So you can do just small changes, incremental changes. So I think we need to adjust depending on what. So I don't have a clear answer, but I would say I would send back the ball to management when the framework is also conceptualized. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that, Monica. Oh, and let me try and squeeze in one last question. Here's a comment on one of your earlier interventions, and it's on measuring. Is there a middle ground between lengthy and expensive assessments and fully systematized systems, such as you were describing, Owen, that stop at counting or making assumptions?
Is there like a middle ground?
Right. Between lengthy and expensive assessments and,
yes,
and fully systematized systems.
Yeah. Well, look, ideally, that's it. I did say how these time use surveys, for instance, are quite costly. Having said that, these, like, where the resources are available, these could be done on a more, on a selective basis. At least to get an understanding in different contexts, for instance, and that lessons could ideally be learned, and this is maybe going to Louise's question as well, that perhaps it doesn't need to be every project, but, again, if you have something from a specific context, just so that you can better understand, does a certain approach work in a certain context? And to understand that, again, we need more sort of, be it a time use survey, an impact evaluation, I think, but again, this doesn't have to be every project. And that's why I think also we need to kind of collaborate more with our research departments and our respective divisions as well. ADB is trying to do this, looping in what we call our Economic Research and Development Impact Team. Again, they're more economists who conduct these impact assessments. But look, for systematizing, the other point I think to make is that, you know, evaluations like the ones we conducted, they're at such a high level, right? And we're talking about things that really take place within the household. You know, these are kind of how people live their lives, how they relate to one another, and they're often very personal things. And for us, you know, even for institutions like those in which we work, to kind of report on something as, oh, transformational change in a corporate scorecard, it's you know, fanciful to think that we would be able to you know, track this. What we can track is, you know, meaningful efforts, I think, by the institution to, you know, nudge in kind of tried and tested areas, for instance, or through approaches that we know can, you know, start conversations. And, you know, but again, that's it. It's the reality comes to kind of very much on the ground work that is kind of often we are removed from sometimes in these high level corporate evaluations. So just to recognize that as well.
Great, thank you very much for that. Oh, and now I just want to wrap up with this lightning round, but I'm going to ask you, each of you, to be very disciplined. I'll have a minute, no more. So there is now a substantial body of evidence on the effectiveness of various approaches to addressing gender equality over the past decade. So let me ask you now to summarize in a minute or less what you believe are the key lessons for future efforts around gender equality and women's empowerment. Elena, let me pick on you first.
You are asking almost impossible to say so quickly this, but no, I would say that probably it's important to reach a minimum standard. So it's definitely essential to get there, but it's equally important to really incentivize and really try to identify, focus, support these more gender transformative efforts, because these are owned by the country, they can be sustainable, they can be impactful, and can be brought to scale. So if we adopt this position, I believe that this requires a big shift, a cultural shift in the institution, and really making the country engagement central and the starting point. I think that the new gender strategy of the bank is going in that direction, wants to go in that direction, and I really hope to see this happening over the next few years.
Thank you very much, Elena. Owen, your closing thoughts.
Okay, I suppose I can say, look, one thing we didn't touch on here, it came up a bit in the incentives question, I think, but that issue of staff, you know, capacity and awareness and knowledge, you know, so we fielded a kind of institution-wide survey among ADB staff, just to, again, test the knowledge and awareness of some of these concepts. You know, is there common understanding of what is transformative, what is intersectionality, what is, you know, what all of these terms that we use, and that's it. In reality, there's you know, there's not great understanding outside of gender experts, right, or very mixed, and we saw this as well, even just through interviews, how the kind of burden for a lot of the gender equality work or actions, it's just, oh, that's the work of the gender team or the gender expert. What I'm getting at here is, like, in reality, this, you know, it's kind of a responsibility across the institutions. And so I think a lot of effort is needed to kind of raise that level of awareness, raise that ownership. And, you know, I should say that, you know, certainly probably now more than ever, right? This needs to kind of be owned, I think, by the institutions, by the staff, as a kind of a core priority, and keep that momentum that we've achieved. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you very much, Owen. That is a key point on shared understanding. Monica, last word to you.
Wow, lots of responsibility. In fact, once again, Elena and Owen touched on two of the points I wanted to make, that I think we have to be aware that countries are borrowing money to do these things. And sometimes it's not easy to convince the decision makers about doing these kind of social aspects in addition to any other objectives that they have. So we need a shared understanding, trying to know what is possible to be done in a certain context, and also the buying, as Owen said, of everyone. So trying to understand and to frame in a way that is not scary, that is not disruptive, that it's for the good of the whole community, the whole country, and not as some people tend to think that sometimes it's to remove the power from a group of people to give it to another one, but it's more for the common good of men, women, and all the society as a whole. That's what I would say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Monica, for that reality check. It's a good note to end on, I think. And thank you all very much for joining us. There is a link to all three of the evaluations in the chat. I hope everyone enjoys the rest of Glocal, and thank you to our speakers. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you. Okay, bye-bye.